Kenichi Ono could hardly breathe. The air seared his lungs as he shouted into the darkness, urging terrified hikers to run for shelter. Stones the size of footballs pounded the earth, smashing against the roof of a mountain lodge with bone-shaking force. In September 2014, hundreds of hikers set out on Mount Ontake, a popular Japanese peak known more for shrines and autumn leaves than for danger. What happened next became the country's deadliest volcanic eruption in nearly a century. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Mount Fuji may be Japan's tallest and most iconic peak, but in the heart of Nagano and Gifu prefectures rises another giant, Mount Ontake, the nation's second highest volcano at 3,067 meters. Unlike Fuji, Ontake did not loom in people's minds as a constant threat. For decades, it had been quiet, often described as a sleeping volcano. But there were years when the mountain stirred. In 1979, Ontake erupted with its largest blast on record, sending a column of ash more than 3 kilometers into the sky and blanketing nearby villages. Yet by a miracle, no one was killed. Then in 2007, it shuddered again, releasing jets of steam and ash, frightening, but again, without casualties. 2 eruptions in 3 decades, both without fatalities, gave Ontake a strangely reassuring reputation. For many, it no longer seemed dangerous at all, but more like a mountain park, famous for shrines and autumn leaves. And that false sense of safety is what drew hundreds of hikers onto its slopes on the morning of Saturday, September 27, 2014. The first light of dawn spread across the peaks. In the lodges at the mountain's base, hikers pulled on boots, adjusted backpacks, and checked their cameras. That morning, nearly 300 people set out on the climb toward the summit. Among them was Kenichi Ono, a seasoned mountain guide. At 47, he had led countless groups up Ontake, trusted for his caution and steady focus on safety. His clients that day were 12 hikers, families, middle-aged walkers, and a few seniors. The forecast promised clear skies, and the trail looked as safe as ever. Ono checked their packs, tightened loose straps, and reminded them to keep a steady pace for the long ascent. Elsewhere on the path, 59-year-old Yuji Tsuno, a photographer from Nagoya, walked with his camera case slung across his shoulder. He often came to Ontake in autumn, hoping to capture the play of clouds around the crater. The Kato family carried a small picnic bag, planning to mark their daughter's birthday at one of the mountain shrines. A group of 5 Kyoto University students hiked together, their climbing jackets bright against the gray rock. By mid-morning, the trails were alive with movement. Groups spread out along the upper slopes, their voices carried by the mountain air. Inside one of the summit lodges, veteran manager Shuichi Mukai poured tea for visitors, talking casually about the weather. He had seen Ontake in many moods, but that day the clouds drifting from the crater seemed heavier than usual. Still, he kept his concerns to himself, not wanting to cause alarm. On the path just below the rim, Ono guided his group steadily upward. A faint smell of sulfur hung in the wind, sharp and metallic. A few hikers remarked on it, but Ono reassured them steam vents were common here. Not far away, Tsuno paused to adjust his lens, capturing the unnaturally dense plumes rising from the crater. The Kyoto students also stopped to take photos, laughing as they posed against the backdrop. Nearby, the Kato family spread a small cloth for their picnic. The atmosphere was calm on the surface, but deep beneath the hikers' feet, water was seeping into cracks, heating against magma-warmed rock, and flashing into steam. Pressure was rising fast, like a kettle sealed too tightly. Around 11:30, subtle unease began to creep in. Tsuno raised his camera once more, framing the crater as clouds thickened into an unnatural wall of white. The Kato family shivered as sulfur vapor drifted across the summit. Inside the nearby lodge, Mukai stood at the window, watching the familiar ridgelines vanish one by one into the haze. On the path, Ono urged his group to stay close. The sulfur stung their noses, clung to their clothes, and blurred the horizon. He scanned the landscape, landmarks swallowed by fog, knowing something was changing, though no one yet understood what. At that very moment, far below, seismometers recorded a pulse of energy, a tremor just 11 minutes before the eruption. 7 minutes later came its peak, a final warning. But up on the mountain, the hikers felt nothing. At 11:52, the mountain exploded. A massive column of ash and superheated gas burst from the crater, rocketing nearly 7 kilometers into the air. Stones, some as small as pebbles, others the size of footballs, rained down with terrifying force. The Kato family had just settled on their picnic cloth. The father reached for his daughter when a stone slammed into his head, leaving him dazed. The mother tried to shield the girl, but she was struck and killed instantly. The daughter screamed, her leg shattered and pinned beneath a fallen boulder. At the crater rim, Yuji Tsuno still had his camera raised when the mountain exploded. His final frame captured the moment the sky filled with ash. He abandoned his tripod and sprinted for a small mountain hut, shoving his pack against the door as stones hammered the roof above. Darkness swallowed the summit. Hikers were trapped in a storm of falling rock and choking ash. The air burned with sulfur, shockwaves rattling the ridgelines. Realizing the catastrophe, Kenichi Ono grabbed one hiker and shouted for his group to move toward shelter, urging them to stay low. Most obeyed, stumbling through the gray haze toward a lodge just 30 meters away. But as they reached the doorway, two were struck by falling stone and killed instantly. Nearby, the eruption overtook the Kyoto University students. 4 were crushed within moments, buried under the hail of rock. The 5th collapsed behind a boulder, his skull fractured, his body scorched by the burning ash and gas. Inside the lodge, Mukai slammed the doors shut as the windows went black. He ordered everyone to cover their faces with blankets and mats. Stones pounded the roof, ash seeped through the cracks, and hikers screamed in the dark. Barely 40 meters away, in another shelter, Ono struggled to control the panic among the survivors. He told them to stay low, to breathe through towels and jackets, and to move away from the windows. Several were bleeding from cuts, but they pressed cloth to their wounds and followed his orders, clinging to the hope the walls would hold. For the next hour, Ontake was a furnace. Pyroclastic flows of gas, ash, and rock tore down the slopes at nearly 100 kilometers per hour. Stones rained constantly, hurled from the crater at speeds close to 300 kilometers per hour. The air itself was deadly. Ash shot 7 kilometers high, then collapsed back, burying the summit in drifts 20 to 30 centimeters deep within an hour. Mixed into the dust were poisonous gases, sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, burning eyes, searing skin, and scalding the lungs of anyone who inhaled. The injured Kyoto student and the young Kato girl both felt as if they were breathing fire. Around them, people collapsed, their bodies quickly hidden beneath a rising blanket of ash. An hour after the first blast, Ontake was still smoldering. Around the crater, the ground disappeared under drifts of gray, up to half a meter deep. Inside the summit shelters, people coughed and moaned, pressing cloths to their faces. The pounding of stones above had begun to fade, and for the first time since the blast, there was a fleeting thought of escape. Yuji Tsuno unsealed the door of his shack. Blinking at the pale world outside, he gathered his camera and began a cautious descent, stopping at intervals to capture what he saw. Twisted shrines buried in ash, bodies lying half-covered, the trail erased as if the mountain itself had turned to dust. In another shelter, Kenichi Ono helped his group to their feet. Some had deep cuts, others trembled from shock, but they were alive. He guided them carefully out, urging everyone to stay close as they made their way down towards safer ground. By this time, rescue teams had begun climbing to meet them. Nearly 250 police officers, firefighters, and Japanese soldiers pushing their way up through the ash. After 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the eruption was finally losing strength. Helicopters from the Japan Self-Defense Force and Nagano police risked landings on the unstable ash fields. Crews carried the first survivors aboard, strapping them to stretchers and flying them down to waiting hospitals. Inside his lodge, Shuchi Mukai sheltered nearly 40 people. They huddled together, still unable to shake the shock, coughing as ash scraped their throats. It is hard to imagine their reaction when, after hours of nothing but stones hammering the roof, the sound was suddenly replaced by rescuers knocking at the door. Ono's group, now 10 survivors, was already making its way down the mountain, their injuries treated at temporary stations on the lower slopes. Ono did not rest. Once his group was safe, he stayed behind, working with rescuers and guiding them to the shelters he knew so well. Meanwhile, Yuji Tsuno, covered in ash but unhurt, made his careful descent on foot until he was met by rescue teams and escorted to safety. But the rescue operation did not go as planned. Ash and falling stones made climbing higher impossible, while helicopters could only attempt landings on the lower slopes. Evacuations focused on those who managed to descend and those found lower on the trails. By nightfall, about 230 of the roughly 300 hikers had been rescued. Yet, by the end of the day, the summit still remained out of reach. Night searches on the upper slopes proved unsuccessful. Visibility was near zero, the air was toxic, and conditions forced teams to retreat. By the evening's count, more than 40 people were still unaccounted for, trapped somewhere near the summit. At dawn, the mountain was quieter, but thin clouds of poisonous gas still drifted in the gray air, leaving the peak shrouded. More than 1,100 soldiers, firefighters, and police swarmed the mountain. They carried stretchers and shovels, masks pressed tight against their faces, climbing through a wasteland that looked more like the moon than a hiking trail. By noon, the grim reality emerged. Dozens of bodies lay scattered along trails and shrines. Among them were the Kyoto University students. 4 were already lifeless. The 5th was carried out alive but gravely injured, and he died before reaching the hospital. Suddenly, the rescuers heard crying. It was the Kato daughter, her leg broken and pinned beneath a stone. Beside her lay her unconscious father and the lifeless body of her mother. The rescuers freed the girl, lifted both survivors onto stretchers, and rushed them to waiting helicopters. In the hospital, the father slowly regained consciousness. Their survival was a miracle of chance. The same boulder that crushed the girl's leg had also shielded them from the deadly rain of debris. Kenichi Ono climbed back up the ash-choked slopes at least twice that day, each time joining rescue teams. With his knowledge of the mountain's hidden trails and huts, he led them to places they might never have reached alone. By nightfall, they had brought down nearly 30 bodies from the mountain, yet not a single new survivor was found. In the days that followed, rescuers pushed themselves to their limits. Some collapsed from exhaustion, overcome by the heat inside their protective suits or by burns from the toxic gas. Still, they climbed, digging with gloved hands and steel poles, uncovering body after body from the ash. By October 1st, the official death toll had risen to 47 confirmed dead. By October 7th, that number reached 54. Nearly all were found in groups near the summit: families, students, elderly climbers, their final moments frozen in ash, just like in the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, destroyed by Vesuvius. By late October, the mission was complete. 57 bodies had been recovered. 6 others remained missing, presumed buried deep beneath the ash. But alongside the grief, the public kept wondering, why were nearly 300 people allowed to climb a volcano that would erupt without mercy just hours later? Scientists later confirmed that Ontake's eruption was phreatic, meaning that it was a blast driven by steam. Unlike magmatic eruptions that send out rivers of lava, phreatic explosions are silent killers. They happen when rainwater or groundwater seeps into the mountain and flashes into steam against superheated rock. And yes, in theory, you could see one coming. Seismometers recorded a spike in tremors on September 11th. And on the morning of September 27th, a brief burst of energy shook the mountain just minutes before the blast. But the signals were too weak, too late, and no alarms were triggered. Families of the victims filed lawsuits against the government and the meteorological agency. They argued that warnings should have been issued, that tremors and sulfur smells in the days before should not have been dismissed. Judges ruled otherwise. According to the science of 2014, a phreatic eruption could not have been predicted. The lawsuits were rejected. Those who survived carried their own marks of the eruption. Yuji Tsuno's final photographs became iconic, appearing in news reports and memorials. Shiuchi Mukai returned to his lodge, remembered as the man who saved nearly 40 lives. The Kato daughter eventually left the hospital with a permanent limp, carrying the memory of a mother who had shielded her in her final moments. Kenichi Ono went back to guiding, but the incident had changed him. He spoke at safety campaigns, reminding others that even the calmest peaks can kill without warning. In the years since, Japan has strengthened its volcanic alert system. Climbers on Ontake are now required to file climbing plans, and new shelters have been built along the trails. But above all, Ontake's eruption left behind a lesson. Sometimes the greatest danger lies not in the nature itself, but in the limits of our knowledge about it. Now, let me ask you, do you think this eruption could have been predicted, or was it truly impossible to see coming? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that reveal the fine line between safety and disaster.